Good afternoon, everyone. Very happy to be with you today. We are here with Intact to talk about youth racial trauma, a therapy panel discussion, and we'll introduce our speakers here in just a moment. So again, my name is Suki Steckel, and I'm with Intact, which is the National Training and Technical Assistance Center for Child, Youth, and Family Mental Health. So just a quick note that the presentation today is part of a funded initiative through SAMHSA, and under this cooperative agreement, the views expressed on the panel today are those of the speakers and not SAMHSA. I'd like to tell you a little bit about our multidisciplinary team here at INTAC. We partner with the Center for Applied Research Solutions, the University of Texas at Austin, the Texas Institute for Excellence in Mental Health, the Georgetown University Center for Child and Human Development, as well as MedStar Georgetown University Hospital, the American Academy of Pediatrics, Change Matrix, Youth Move National, FREDLA, which is the Family-Run Executive Director Leadership Association, as well as a number of individual subject matter experts across the children's behavioral health services sector. And we're very excited to come to you today with this session. Our goal here at INTAC is that all children, youth, young adults, and families with emotional or behavioral health needs can access evidence-based treatment and recovery services in a well-coordinated system of care. And how we support that goal is by serving folks from cross-sector audiences, such as yourself, from state and local agency leaders, a variety of members of the mental health workforce, primary care providers, the school-based workforce, community-based providers, peer supervisors, family partners, youth partners, and really anyone who is involved in the life of children with mental health needs and their families. We are here to support you in your work. Lastly, just a quick note about our services. They are at no cost to you, and we provide a variety of different formats for training and technical assistance, everything from individual consultation, tools and work products, podcasts. Our 5 Things Digest series highlights kind of timely subject matter around the children's behavioral health needs. We also offer training academies and communities of practice. So please do join us here at our website to learn more. And now I would like to turn it over to Dr. Stephen Nifley Jr. and his partners in their work on youth racial trauma. And we're excited to hear more from you. So I'm going to pass it over to you, Dr. Nifley.
So my name is Dr. Stephen D. Nifley Jr. I am an associate professor here in the School of Professional Psychology at Spalding University. And I'm also the Chief Diversity Officer here at Spalding, and am the director of the Collective Care Center, which is one of very few racial trauma clinics in the entire country that specializes in the treatment of race-based stress and trauma, as well as training for clinicians in our 2 therapeutic approaches, and then also providing community education to those folks that have been impacted by the experience of racial trauma. I'm going to take a pause here and also allow a chance for our panelists to introduce themselves as well.
I am Olivia Campbell. I am a 4th year doctoral student in Spalding's School of Professional Psychology PsyD program. I have the pleasure of working with Dr. Nifley on the Youth Racial Trauma Therapy Research Lab. It's a mouthful. And my research interests, of course, are related to children. I am studying child, adolescent, family psychology and health psychology. So just really interested in looking at the impact that racial trauma can have in the educational sector, in the healthcare sector, and things like that. So excited to have you guys join all of us today.
Hello, I am Jennifer Ranick. I also work with Dr. Nifley and Olivia Campbell on the Youth Racial Trauma Research Lab. I'm also in my 4th year at Spalding University in their PsyD program, and my research interests are in foster care and juvenile justice, specifically policy reform.
Hello, everyone. I'm Michelle Niehaus. I'm the program administrator for Deaf and Hard of Hearing Services at the Kentucky Division for Behavioral Health. And in that role, I also get to serve on our System of Care 5 federal grant on the grant implementation team. And I'm working with our Behavioral Health Equity Action Planning Group and the changes we want to see in our state around racial equity. So glad to be here and so excited that you get to learn from Dr. Nifley and his team, because the work that they've done is absolutely amazing.
Yeah, thank you all so much for being here and for sharing this space with me as we share a little bit about how we can support youth, BIPOC youth specifically, that are struggling with racial trauma. So we have a couple of goals as a part of our conversation today. I'm just going to spend a very brief time talking a little bit about what is youth racial trauma therapy, assessment, and training. And then we'll talk about our partnership with the Kentucky Department for Behavioral Health, Developmental and Intellectual Disabilities through the CCC, the Collective Care Center. I then want to open it up for a conversation with our awesome panelists here. And then we'll end by providing an opportunity for you all to ask questions in the chat or otherwise that we can provide support to you around. So first, just a little bit about, well, what is race-based stress and trauma? According to what the literature is telling us, race-based stress and trauma influences folks in 3 areas: racial identity development, so how do you think about yourself as a Black or brown person within the context of systemic racism and just ideals around ethnic and racial backgrounds. One's ability to process racially traumatic events. So do I have the coping skills to be able to address this situation? What does this mean for me as a Black or brown person that I'm encountering my challenges? And then also just developing those skills that are needed to address instances of racism and discrimination. The science is telling us that there are 3 major components that influence the experience of race-related stress and trauma. Aversive hostile racism, so when one experiences interpersonal hostilities within the school setting, the work setting, out in their environments that are designed to remind them that they don't deserve to be in certain spaces. The next one here is micro-invalidations. And so these are when we try to communicate those interpersonal difficulties to other folks, and they tell us that what we're experiencing is made up, that it's not true, that we're just making things up. Those are what those micro-invalidations are. The last piece here is vicarious racism. So while we're trying to navigate those interpersonal difficulties based on race and racism, and we're being told that our experiences are not true via the experience of micro-invalidations, we're still also having to navigate bearing witness to other folks who are having their own encounters with racism and discrimination as well. And the science is telling us that it is these 3 components that are causing the difficulties when it comes to encounters with race-related stress and trauma. So important thing to know here is, well, as we're having this conversation around youth, how have our youth learned to cope with this combination of vicarious racism, aversive hostile racism, and micro-invalidations? The science is telling us there are 3 components that are a part of their coping strategies. Racial socialization, so the ways in which they are prepared to navigate the world as a BIPOC individual based on their families of origin, the media, their peer circles, etc. The difference between racial literacy and racial legacy messaging. And so racial literacy is all about having a 3-tiered social skill set that you can use to navigate racist situations by identifying something as racist, being able to identify your coping strategies, and to being able to evaluate the effectiveness of your coping strategies in those settings. Racial legacy refers to receiving messaging that warns you about how difficult things will be as a Black or brown person. We typically lean into racial literacy messaging, and this is a part of our youth racial trauma therapy approach, because we recognize that racial legacy messaging is limiting because it doesn't tell you what to do when you encounter a racist situation. Lastly, here, our youth learn how to cope with racism and discrimination through the messaging that they receive and have received from prior generations in terms of how to cope and the meaning that they make of racism for them as BIPOC individuals. And each one of our youth racial trauma strategies helps to address each one of these areas. So a little bit about youth racial trauma therapy. We have a number of assessment tools that you can use. specifically designed to assess for the experience of discrimination via our discrimination scale, both our child report and our parent report. We also have a measure that we use to assess for the experience of internalized racism, so how youth have been taught to think about themselves and to think poorly about themselves as BIPOC individuals via our internalized racism projective measure. And so what we're looking for is, has that youth experienced a traumatic situation that they would attribute to their racial background? And then do they report significant difficulties related to internalized racism, as well as high scores on our discrimination skills, both the child and parent reports? Our approach to therapy focuses on 3 areas for youth: awareness, affirmation, and advocacy. So as we think about the racial socialization process, if we're not having conversations around race and racism with our youth, that can cause difficulties because they are not prepared for what might come their way when they have those first encounters with microaggressions, et cetera. We also try to utilize the space as a source of affirmation where they learn more about what it means to be a BIPOC individual and learn the positive aspects of their society, which oftentimes is not communicated to them. And then most importantly, we teach them how to advocate for themselves based on experiences of microaggressions and racism and discrimination, both within individual interpersonal context, as well as within the larger context of systems that they might encounter, such as the criminal justice system, education system, et cetera. Our racial trauma therapy model for youth consists of 16 sessions and utilizes our 137-page manual that is very comprehensive and includes everything that you would need in order to support a youth that is struggling with racism and discrimination and the impact of race-related stress. So we have the assessment tools that I mentioned before, our discrimination scales, our internalized racism projective measure, but we also have weekly evaluation tools that you can utilize to assess for ongoing progress across the 16 sessions, including our weekly rating scale for caregivers, as well as our coaching form for those caregivers as well, because we recognize that no approach to therapy with youth will be helpful unless our caregivers are involved as well. And so there's a significant caregiver coaching component to each session. Additionally, the manual includes comprehensive session outlines that provide you significant instruction about what to do during each session from beginning to end. We also include a very comprehensive racial trauma processing workbook that supports the youth in making meaning of the racist and traumatic experiences that they've had, as well as learning what to do whenever they encounter those experiences again. So I want to talk now a little bit about our partnership with our awesome folks here in the state of Kentucky. So we recognize that when it comes to just a little bit about the Collective Care Center first, we are located at Spalding University, which is located here in Louisville, Kentucky. As I mentioned before, we provide training to those clinicians that are looking to learn more about how to utilize our manual for racial trauma therapy for youth. Today, we have trained over 800 clinicians now in our approach to therapy. We also have a lab in which we're utilizing research to provide additional evidence for all of our measures, and then also to evaluate the effectiveness of both our training and our services. So when it came to the partnership with our awesome state partners here, this was established through our SOC 5 grant, which had the following deliverables. So we designed a youth racial trauma therapy overview training for community mental health organizations worldwide. We provide ongoing assessment and consultation training for community mental health agencies when it comes to youth racial trauma. We developed and are implementing a youth racial trauma therapy assessment protocol. We're developing and implementing a youth racial trauma therapy assessment protocol training for community mental health clinicians. And they're also currently involved in significant research, as you heard with our students here, in regards to dissertations and other publications to evaluate the effectiveness of our training and our youth racial trauma therapy protocol. So now I just want to open up to our panelists to have some conversation around a couple of topics here. And want to first share the questions with you, and then we'll stop sharing the screen, I believe, and try to highlight folks as we try to answer the questions. So the first one here is, why is it important to have a racial trauma therapy and assessment protocol specifically for youth between the ages of 6 and 12? So why is it important for us to have a racial trauma therapy protocol and assessment tools for youth between the ages of 6 and 12?
I think in answering that question, there's a multitude of reasons, but what kind of first comes to mind for me is just the sensitivity of that age, that time, being 6 to 12, being in elementary school. And I think when you're that young, you just don't have the tools or the knowledge or the words to describe some of these things that are happening to you when it comes to discrimination or microaggressions. And if you don't learn that when you're younger, as you get older, of course, that becomes harder to identify. And so I see bringing this therapy in at such a young age as almost being like a preventative type of measure. Helping these children is not just helping them now, but also as they get older and become adults. And while there is a youth racial trauma therapy for adults, maybe the hope is that, in doing it for kids, they can avoid some of these hardships that they might face if a lot of these issues weren't met at such a young age. Plus, there's just not a lot of research on this topic in general. It's something I think over the last year on this project I've learned is this kind of therapy, this kind of treatment for young kiddos, it's not out there. So that would probably be the primary reason, is someone has to do it. And I'm glad that we got to be the ones to hopefully start that wave.
That's so well said, Olivia. I think that when we do a lot of our mental health work, we think about protocols and we think about addressing adult needs. But if we don't address the needs of the children, then we're letting identity happen. We're missing these critical periods of identity development, critical periods of growth. And by having a racial trauma therapy training for that age group, we're looking at addressing the needs of the child and the entire family, and not waiting until further trauma and deeper trauma has existed, but catching it earlier and giving people those tools.
I think my colleagues have said it very well. It's just knowing that 6 to 12-year-olds, that's when they're learning about themselves and figuring out their place in the world and how they can move forward, and giving them the skills to be preventative about creating excessive trauma.
So I appreciate our panelists' answers here. And just to kind of summarize, it's so important for us to have these type of specific approaches, because we need to be able to address the specific types of needs that our youth are facing. There's a big difference between a 13-year-old who's grappling with racial trauma and a 7-year-old that's grappling with racial trauma. There's a different way in which they're communicating those needs. There's a different way in which we provide support to them within the therapeutic setting. There's also just a different way in which we assess for the experience of racial trauma for those folks. And so it's really important that we have specific tools and therapeutic approaches to address the specific needs of that particular population. Thank you all for sharing such meaningful answers there. The next question to ask, so we talked a little bit about the need for therapy protocols that are specific to the experiences of our youth. What about training? Why is it so important for us to have training that focuses on addressing the needs of our youth between the ages of 6 and 12 that identifies BIPOC individuals?
I can start from the clinician's perspective. I mean, I think that we're in a new era of how we talk about race, how we talk about racism, how we talk about intersectionality, how we talk about the impact of race and racial trauma as part of trauma-informed care. And unless we have shared vocabulary and shared language around that, And unless we have evidence-based approaches to how to address it, people don't know how to have the conversations, much less how to treat potentially life-impacting emotional experiences. So unless we have training and coaching, people are going to make their own kinds of approaches, and they're not going to do it in an evidence-based way. So by taking science and compassion and vigorous research, we can help move this process along and create new evidence-based practices, and then support clinicians so that it's not like, here's a workbook, good luck, but it's more, let's go through this training, let's talk about it, and let's also, as clinicians, evaluate our own experiences, because who we are and who we bring into this work is vital when we're addressing racial trauma. And so I think that training piece is really important because it allows space to do that.
As a practicing student clinician, we are told all the time that if a child is experiencing trauma, you can't really treat until after the trauma has finished, and racial trauma is ongoing. It will never end. And so having a training for clinicians so that they can learn how racial trauma is different from other traumas and that you can treat it and help develop skills for the individual, I feel is very important.
Yeah, Jennifer, I think your answer is a really important point to bring up. Just the differences between racial trauma and other types of trauma are so stark that if you're looking at it strictly from a more general trauma focused lens, there are a lot of things that you're going to miss. And, sadly, with racial trauma, it is something that's ongoing, it's insidious. And even as we're giving these children tools, that doesn't mean that we're necessarily even stopping the trauma from happening. It's more of managing the impact. So I really appreciated that answer. And then someone in the chat also mentioned it being training as a support pathway. And I hadn't thought of that, but honestly, I think that's a great answer. By having a group of people who are receiving this training together and sort of working through how to treat racial trauma, it allows clinicians to have support networks too. And I think that's very important because this is hard work that we're doing. So of course we need to support the kids, but we need to support the clinicians and help to protect them against things like burnout, but also just to process tough cases, tough emotions, things that pop up. So appreciate y'all's input in the comments for sure.
Excellent answers. There was a study by Evans and Hemmings, 2018, that looked at how much training do clinicians get when it comes to addressing race-based stress and trauma. And what they found in their survey is that 83% of clinicians receive no training when it comes to the experience of racism and discrimination for Black and Brown folks. The challenge is that 96% of Black Americans specifically are reporting daily encounters with racism and discrimination. And then also our BIPOC youth are experiencing up to 6 microaggressions a day that is having a significant impact on their mental health. And so the challenge is that as we are seeing an increase in the number of folks that are struggling with race-based stress and trauma, our training is not keeping up with supporting our clinicians and knowing what to do when it comes to assessing for racial trauma, recognizing that it is different from the experience of PTSD, as well as being able to treat folks in terms of therapeutic interventions to help them to address racial identity issues, to help address developing coping strategies, to process racial trauma, and then also to support those caregivers that are trying to support their youth that are learning about racism and discrimination. So we do offer a training here in support with the state. We developed a 6-hour self-paced virtual training that folks can take in the comfort of their own homes that teaches them all that you would need to know from theory to assessment to therapy to evaluation concerning the process of supporting youth that have experienced youth racial trauma. And so as a part of that approach, You learn about what causes racial trauma in youth. How does it impact them psychologically? How does it impact them physically? How might it show up in the school setting? How might it show up in the housing and public safety settings as well? We also provide you support in learning about our assessment tools. So how do you assess for the impact of discrimination? How do you utilize our internalized racism projective measure? We also talk with you about how to support folks that are caregivers for our youth. So how do you invite them to be a part of the conversation via our coaching tools? The training is accessible. You can take it anywhere. We'd be happy to talk with you about how to access that training for yourself or for your agencies. Another question that we oftentimes get asked is, well, what if I'm a white clinician? Am I able to utilize this approach? And what does that training look like for me? And we have an additional module that talks about how do we engage in this type of work as a white clinician. And so it walks you through the process of being more culturally responsive, more culturally aware, just all those strategies and tools that are needed to be helpful as a white ally in those spaces. And so we'll welcome you to be a part of that conversation as well. So there are some approaches out there from a training standpoint that could be helpful to you that are also accessible as well. So all of our folks here have been connected to our youth racial trauma therapy lab as in our protocol development and our assessment tool development in some form or fashion, either on the state level or as members of the lab. And so just want to give you all an opportunity to talk about, well, what has been your experience being a partner with me and with us in engaging in this type of work.
Yeah, I think, just reflecting on how we probably started working together a year ago at this point, and just thinking, number one, about all of the things I've learned in the past year. I could honestly say that before we started doing this work, I'm not even sure if I would have been able to identify racism or discrimination as something that is traumatic, that is a traumatic event. And so I think, number one, it has definitely reshaped the way that I view trauma and the way that I view the impact that racism and discrimination have on kids. I think also, as a Black woman living in Louisville and the things that have happened in this city over the past, 3-ish years, there's always been this sense of, I want to do something that is tangible. I want to make change, but I don't know how. I feel like I'm just one person. And being a part of this lab has really been, eye-opening in the different ways and things that we can do to make, more systemic systems level change. And knowing that this was something that the state of Kentucky wanted to partner with us in has been amazing. Thanks to the work that Michelle and her crew have done, it has given us a lot of great opportunities to do things that we wouldn't have been able to do otherwise. So I think my experience with it all in genuinely would just be an educational, growth process. I have learned so much, and I'm excited to be able to take that training here and hopefully, as I move on out of the program and into the field of psychology as a whole, this is something I can take with me. This is something that people across the nation have expressed interest in learning, and it's such a valuable tool to have and teach others about. So I appreciate all of y'all's interest in it. And I, of course, appreciate Dr. Nifley for giving us the opportunity to work with him in this.
I agree. I am extremely forever grateful to Dr. Nifley. I mean, he has influenced my theoretical orientation. He has just expanded my knowledge on so many issues and definitely helped me progress in my diversity journey. And I feel like this training and being part of this lab has helped me start to become a better clinician and be able to address issues that I don't feel that I would have addressed otherwise. And then also as a mother of 2 BIPOC children, I feel like this has helped me as well in recognizing, being able to better recognize things that my children will be going through and help also give them the skills that they'll need to survive out there.
It's hard to put into words, I think, what the experience has been like, because I can't imagine that we would have had this conversation 2 years ago. And so to think about the horrors that have happened in our country and to think about the horrors that were brought to attention that prompted some of these conversations, they've been going on for hundreds of years. And I think for me, as somebody who works in the state and thinks about what can we do in our sphere of influence, it was really important to think about what can we do to help people who are experiencing pain right now, while we also try to address systemic racism in real and tangible ways. So like with what you were saying, Olivia, that combination of what can we do right now. So for me, it's been very transformational as far as thinking about what's possible when we connect with each other, what's possible when we find the expertise in our own communities and we are able to affect change quickly in some ways. The Collective Care Center was there and this had already been developed by Dr. Nifley, but it makes me sad to think we may not have used that if the things had not happened in Louisville in the summer of 2020 that did. So I think for me, it's been exciting as well to see what we've been able to build and how there's a ripple effect. So we started off training our clinicians around the adult racial trauma training, and then you all were able to expand to the youth version. And we're seeing PhD students who are going out in the world taking this information. So the capacity building has been amazing. And then just personally thinking about who I am as a white woman working in social work and thinking about what I need to be doing and what I need to be more aware of and tangible ways that we can affect change. That's been absolutely amazing over the past couple of years.
So I hope as we're having our conversation here, you're able to see both the benefit and the necessity of having these type of approaches when it comes to assessment and treatment for our youth, but also thinking about the impact that it can have on the student level, on the clinician level, as well as on the systems level. Our next question here really talks a lot about although there are some significant benefits, I know many folks, as they're perhaps thinking about having this type of training or having this type of approach in their own work, what are some challenges and opportunities that we've faced as a system? And so just want to make sure that we're transparent and honest and thinking about what are some challenges that we need to navigate as folks are potentially thinking about incorporating this type of work into their own organizations as well.
I can speak to the systemic barriers and the challenges we've had in the state. Sometimes it was as simple as one agency's funding structure is not the same as the other's funding structure, and how do we communicate to get funding where it needs to go. We've also faced challenges around federal edicts that were happening when we started to try to partner. We actually had to pause for about 6 months because we weren't allowed to do training related to racial equity for a while. I think we continue to face potential threats from different political bodies around what we can and can't do. And then also thinking about priorities. Unfortunately, with COVID, there's so many different things happening in the world, and people who may have really wanted to affect change at the beginning and wanted to do things differently, it's hard to sustain that over the course of 2, 3, 4 years or an entire career. So I think people need to be mindful that if you start this work, it needs to be a commitment to doing the work. It's not a one time and you're done. And I think clinicians who started the training on the adult version didn't expect the personal questions they would have for themselves and the personal journey that they would go on. So finding people who are willing to do that, and also finding people who are able to recruit or address the needs of children and youth who've experienced racial trauma, and to be able to find the folks to work with to hone their skills in this protocol. Those are some of the challenges I can think of that we've addressed.
Yeah, and I also think of how community mental health as a whole is just right now understaffed and underfunded, and people who work in that sector are already asked to do so many things every day. And I know sometimes it can feel like a big ask to say, you're already doing this. Now let's bring in this new way to treat people, this new way to look at things. And especially coming from an academic standpoint, it can be easy for people in academia to, we can see the problem and see the solution so clearly as we sit and write our dissertations. But when you get down to real systems level things, we're asking real people to do things that are not easy, and that they may realistically just not have the time or energy to do. Of course, it's worth the time and energy, but just being aware of those kinds of barriers, being aware that even though it may seem clear and obvious what the problem is and what possible solutions are, it's going to take time, and it's also going to take an increase in resources and funding towards these community mental health agencies and towards research that looks at things like racial trauma.
I think another large barrier that we can face is, in my experience, the white community has deliberate ignorance to a lot of these issues, and they are very resistant to doing the work. There's also, I feel, a huge amount of compassion fatigue. I feel like most of the country was very on board with many of these issues for approximately 3 months, about 18 months ago, and now it's kind of dropped off significantly. And so I can see that being a barrier of trying to push forward and continuing to make it known that these issues do not go away, and there's massive work that continues to be done.
Jennifer, I think you stated that well. And what do we have that can counter that? So being able to put in place policies, procedures, systems, having racial equity plans in place that have goals, so that if there's turnover of staff, if there's turnover of leadership, that we still have that ingrained in the organizations we work in. It's not one person's pet project, but it's really what everybody should be working towards, and building that equity focus into everything. One thing that's been the flip side of the barrier, the support for us has been supreme support from our commissioner's office and from our secretary's office to do this work. And so being able to say, we have the authority to do this and to be able to move forward, and being committed to that and being accountable for it, not just, oh, we'll try this, and then when it gets hard, never mind, we'll move on, but working through those challenges.
Thank you all so much for your thoughts. So as you hear, there are a couple of different challenges that are important for us to address as we get into this type of work. And so addressing potential systemic barriers in regards to organizational fatigue, or policies that might hinder engaging in these type of efforts. It's also important to be aware of some of the individual challenges that might come up for folks. So for folks of color that engage in this work, we are doing something that we also are potentially experiencing ourselves. And so how do we navigate the impact of racial trauma when we ourselves are also encountering that as well? And so making sure we're aware of that. Also thinking about for our white allies, how can we stay leaned in when guilt or fear or worries about ignorance might also get in the way. And these are kind of ongoing conversations that we've had as a part of our work here through our consultation calls and things along those lines. And we'll encourage you to think about as well in your work. So the last question that we have before we just kind of open it up for questions from others, I see a couple of questions here in the chat, and we'll try to look through a couple of those to get some answers to you. But if folks are thinking about engaging in this type of work, either at the individual level or at the organizational level, what tips might you offer based on what you've seen as successes in the work that we've been doing?
just be willing to do it and jump in. I think, when I first started working through the training and understanding pieces of it, there was definitely a part of me that was like, wow, I'm not qualified to do this. I can't do this. But there's certainly a learning curve that comes along with it. There's a lot of supports if you do choose to enroll in the training that we have. And so just being open to jumping into it, knowing that mistakes might come, knowing that you might falter, I think that's really important. It's also really important to have a community of support, or whether that's supervisors, co-therapists, to lean on to talk about these things with, because, whether you're a clinician of color working with other clients of color, or you're a white person working with these people, it's going to have an impact on you in some way. So just making sure that you have people that you're accountable to, people to lean on for support, is super important too. So I would say, don't be afraid to, one, engage in the therapy and do it, but also don't be afraid to reach out to others, and have those supporters, those people cheering you on and who you're supporting back as well.
There's definitely a reason why it's called the Collective Care Center, right? We don't do this work alone. And if we're able to work together, it's going to go further. I think that having grace with each other, having that flexibility, it may or may not go the way you expect, but if it doesn't go the way you expect, it may go in way better ways than you could have ever imagined. I think that being willing to ask what your own personal lacks of knowledge are, or just the questions that come up, being in a state of curiosity and learning and being willing to be vulnerable. I think as a white person, it's really important for me to know what I don't know, or to at least be willing and open to feedback of, where are my areas for growth, and where am I going to say something really stupid and then fix that because I've got relationship with people, and being able to approach the entire process that way, that we can learn together and we can create something better for the next generation, whether it's for our kids, and for the people who we're working with and serving. I think those are all really critical elements for this. And seeking expertise, not thinking that because you're the state authority on mental health that you know what you're doing as far as racial equity. Who are the authorities in your state? Who are the authorities in the country? And how can you reach out to them and learn? That's been a huge benefit, to get to know Dr. Nifley and his amazing work, and to never be treated as less than or not knowing, but more of, okay, how can we take what we know and bring it together to create something good together?
Our understanding of racial trauma theory, of racial trauma in youth. We've talked a little bit about what does youth racial trauma therapy look like in regards to both our treatment protocol and assessment. Our amazing panelists here have shared their perspective when it comes to challenging opportunities, engaging in this type of work, the importance of training, the importance of therapy with this particular population.
I wanted to know how to, I think you all mentioned it, but are there any links or directly to obtaining the workbook, and how do we go about being a part of the training for clinicians if we're out of state?
Sure. So I'll put in the training, a link to information about the training on the website. Because we really value fidelity, it's really important that you go through the training in order to get the manual. I think one day I'll get comfortable enough to where you could buy the manual separately. But there's just so much that goes into supporting youth that we want to make sure that you're taken care of when it comes to that. So I'm putting that in the chat now. There's a cost associated with it. I'd be happy to talk with you about that cost. If you're looking at doing this at the organizational level, I know that we've partnered with our organizations here in the state, as well as organizations across the country, that we're willing to offer a reduced price for more clinicians being involved. Another thing to note here is that we do offer 6 CEUs. Because it's 6 hours worth of training, and so we'll be willing to partner with you and your state agency body in terms of your licensing body to provide your certificate and the other evidence that you need in order to get that approved. So that's the training there. I think I saw another question about the youth piece. That's what I saw. Thank you.
Thank you.
So we do offer a youth racial trauma first aid training that is free and virtual and self-paced for middle school and high school youth. It teaches them how to identify racial trauma. It teaches them what is racial trauma. And it also teaches them how to get help for themselves, as well as how to help other BIPOC folks get help as well. They get a nice little certification at the end that says that they've been trained in youth racial trauma first aid. And in that link that's on our website there, you can also just kind of look up at the top, and there should be a link that will take you to the youth racial trauma first aid training as well. And once again, that's virtual, completely self-paced, and something that is accessible to our youth that are in middle school and high school.
I have another question, sorry.
Sure.
I'm just wondering, here in Florida, well, specifically I'm in Tampa, Florida. I know that there are, it's newer, it's emerging as far as like having like a behavioral health component to basically when officers go out on different calls, whether it be domestic or, other things considering mental health concerns. Just wondering, have there been like talks or conversations about getting, maybe your local police agencies involved, or they have similar trainings, or is this something that we could, I know it's like a far reach, kind of have them be a part of for, community policing and just having the knowledge of that. It's on my mind, particularly because I joined this training. I recently had a participant that I'm working with who was stopped by the police, and then subsequently, like the police K9 had just basically attacked him. It's starting to open up the conversation a little bit more, the dialogue a little bit more, specifically where I am in Tampa, Florida, about, protocols, community policing, and then on our end, like how to address this with the family. And, it's a tough conversation to have. So I know that was a loaded question, but.
Sure. So I've been a law enforcement consultant for almost a decade now. And so I've really been working with them and with agencies across the country when it comes to DEI efforts. I think to really was to reflect on the role that racial trauma training could play with those particular agencies is twofold. The first one is making sure that our folks are aware within the law enforcement community about racial trauma looks like and how that might be in a factor that could be impacting how folks are engaging with them. If I've been taught my whole life that police are not all that great, and then I'll see kind of like evidence to support that, it will make sense then why I'm running away from you or not being as compliant. So much so that there's actually laws that are being changed that prevents law enforcement officers from using that as an excuse to shoot people. I know that the Massachusetts Supreme Court, I believe, upheld or offered a ruling or an opinion that threw out an argument that a law enforcement agency was making in regards to how they interacted with the individual, because they said that because there has been this historical fear that Black males specifically have had, that you can't use that as an excuse anymore to shoot people, essentially. So there's that part, making sure that our law enforcement folks are trained and have a good awareness of racial trauma and how it can show up in spaces. Another thing that I'm seeing a lot of, and actually something that Spalding is partnering with our local community here, is providing diversions. So in my consultations with law enforcement officers, one of the things that they talk about often is about how they're one of the very few 24-hour social service organizations, which means that they're being called out to do things that are not really kind of like law enforcement related. And some of that also has to do with mental health related issues as well. My understanding is that they get at most, a couple of hours of training when it comes to interacting with folks that have mental health related issues. And so are not trained, and neither is it appropriate for them to be out there because there's a high incidence of folks with mental health issues being shot and killed by law enforcement officers because they escalate the situation rather than de-escalate. And so we've been partnering, the city's been partnering with Spalding and our social work folks to use social workers and other mental health professionals to go out to certain calls that may involve a more mental health component. And so I've been partnering, we'll be partnering with our Spalding community here, our social work program, to provide the racial trauma training component. So as you think about how you could translate some of that into your work down in Florida or other folks across the country, making sure to provide that support to your law enforcement folks to develop that awareness. And then also, if there are already programs out there or potential programs that could be created that allow for more mental health professionals to be a part of these calls, the ones that are needed for them, making sure that they're racial trauma trained as well.
And to add to that, Dr. Nipley, that is something that state mental health authorities can be involved in. The Alternative Response Project is something that our Department for Behavioral Health is partnering with Spalding and with the Louisville Metro Police Department on. So it's always a loaded question to bring up, but I think it's also vital that we talk about it and that we absolutely address the needs. And our department's been doing that and getting to partner with different departments of Spalding and different expertise has also been a great way to start off professionals thinking about that and thinking about those collaborations versus people who may not have thought about it early in their career.
So I think we have about 5 minutes left or so. What other questions might you have for us that we could be helpful to you?
I have a question, Dr. Niffley, just about implementation and thinking about what you might recommend for an organization or a state looking to expand their offerings and support clinicians to go through this training and to be addressing this. And I'm thinking specifically about some of those implementation drivers or any kind of assessments for readiness that you might recommend. So you're looking at the full kind of culture of an organization, and are you ready to have your clinicians go through this, or are there certain things that you would recommend of your clinicians or of your leadership at an organizational level before you enlist your clinicians in going through this training?
Absolutely. So there are 3 levels or 3 stages that we typically take folks through to kind of ease them into the process of thinking about training. The first one is just providing a general overview about what is racial trauma and what is racial trauma therapy. And we always offer a pre-post assessment for that that gives folks an idea of where their clinicians are at the beginning, and then what type of information do they need additional support around as they engage in this type of work. At that point, there's 2 routes that we can go. The next route would be thinking about assessment tools, because that's typically something that is most widely applicable to most folks in the state agency. So if you're not a clinician, but you're an intake specialist, we have an administrative title, we could all benefit from just having a general awareness of how do we identify race-based stress and trauma. And then the next step after that would be a more comprehensive training. If at the end of this, you see that your folks are open, but you can see some hesitancy, we can also engage in a little bit more DEI work, where we provide some training around microaggressions and around concepts such as culture of humility to make sure folks are at their greatest readiness to engage in this type of work. And then we'll move into the assessment piece. So the assessment tools that we have are a pre-post measure to see how folks are thinking about the training. And then based on conversations with leadership or with other folks in your organization, we could then make a determination of whether or not they can go into the assessment piece, or if they need additional support in regards to some DEI type of training. And those are both things that we can provide to be helpful to you all. So I think we are at our time. Feel free to check out our website, the drstephenniffley.jr.com. I do also have an Instagram, if that will be helpful to you. And you're more welcome to follow that to keep up with the information that we're providing around racial trauma and all those type of things. Also, I post pictures every once in a while of my cute little guy. His name is Justice. And if you're just looking for something that will make you happy, nothing makes me more happy than seeing his little smiling face. And so those are two ways that you can stay connected to myself and to our lab and the work that we're doing. I look forward to hearing from you all and supporting you in this type of work.
Thank you so much, Dr. Nifley and Jennifer, Michelle, and Olivia. This has been a really informative panel. Really appreciate your time today, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of the week.